Well, good morning. Ian. Oh, I'm not hearing myself. How are you all doing today? Ducky. Pretty standard answer there. That's good. Today we have a not an easy topic that we're covering and looking at. We are, of course, looking at the sixth commandment: "You shall not murder." Looking at the sacredness of life. And this is found in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Interesting thing about Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, and a couple of these texts as we go through these commands, is that there are, in the Hebrew, only two words in this verse. It says in Hebrew, lo tirzah, you shall not murder. The lo is the negative, so it's really, if we read it straight and as it would say, it was, no, you shall murder. Or negate, you shall murder. So we have this understanding of what could happen, and God saying, no, you're not going to murder. And as I was preparing this and looking at this, and I have to say, there's a certain challenge in doing a sermon the way that we've been doing this series on the Ten Commandments when there's only two words in the original language in the commandment. And one of those words is no. And while I was working on this sermon, and I've kind of been working on it the last 2 weeks. I preached it last week at the Benton Church, and it was not completely finished when I started preaching it, but that's the reality of preaching, is that you preach with what you have when it comes time. And so this week I've worked on it a little bit more, and I keep being reminded of the story behind how the Dr. Seuss book, Green Eggs and Ham, came to be in existence. I don't know if you're familiar with how Dr. Seuss ended up writing the story Green Eggs and Ham. It's a very simple little story of, there's basically two characters. There's Sam I Am and the person whom Sam I Am is trying to feed these green eggs and ham. And he doesn't want them. And he lists all the different places where he doesn't want them and where he would not eat them and with whom he would not eat them and all of this. And then he tries them. And then all of those places and people he said he would not eat it at or with, he's now willing to eat this food because he decides that it's really good. And it's an incredibly repetitive, rhyming book. And it all came to be because someone had challenged him to write a children's book using only 42 words, to limit himself and use only 42 words. And so, Dr. Seuss, if you go through and count the distinct words in the book, Green Eggs and Ham, there are only 42 distinct words. They are repeated, of course. There are only 42 distinct words in that. And that kind of difficulty of adding this thing on, I felt a little bit like Dr. Seuss trying to build an entire sermon out of "You shall not murder." And of course, the theme goes beyond just this one text. And so we want to look at the commandments where we see this and see what it is that's really going on here and get kind of why God would say, shall not murder. So we're going to look at the commandments, and you see the bracket S, the commandments that are around murder. We'll start, of course, in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 and 2 to remind us of how these commandments were given. It says, then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall not murder. That part of the reason for you shall not murder is derived from the fact that God brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That God had done something for them to deliver them, and this is part of why they should not commit murder. Now, I will say there are different English versions of the Bible here that read this word murder differently. The King James says, "Thou shalt not kill." And there are others. Usually, it's kill and murder that come through. But when we look at the root word here that's used of razah in Hebrew, we see that the common usage of it is to murder, to slaughter, or to slay. And the slightly less common usage of it is to translate it as to kill. So this word tends to bring about the idea of intent, that there is an intent to kill. And we see this definition. This is from the Erdman's Bible Dictionary on murder, and it says, strictly speaking, the willful or premeditated deprivation of human life. The willful or premeditated deprivation of human life. This, of course, is, very dictionary formal speak for taking someone's life deliberately, willfully, or planned out ahead of time, the premeditated. And when we see this here, we definitely have this, it's something that many societies have shown, that if someone is planning murder or willfully kills another person, willfully takes their lives or plans to take their life, there are societies, many societies, that view that that person is not acting human. Whether they view it as there's something broken in their brain and they are at that point kind of subhuman because of these actions, that they don't have the conscience that we tend to have, that tells us what is right from wrong and determines what we would or would not do. There are some societies that view someone who murders as someone who has been possessed by a demonic force, because no human could do that without possession by a demonic force, without having that demonic or devilish influence against them. These kinds of things exist, and when we look at most society, every society values life in some way, values human life in some way, and recognizes the value of it. And God, in saying you shall not murder, is also telling us partly that we need to recognize the value of human life. But Exodus chapter 20 is not the only place that we have a commandment not to kill, not to murder, where we have thoughts on this. And I'm not just talking about Deuteronomy chapter 5, where the Ten Commandments are repeated for the people before they go into the land of Canaan. But in the New Testament, we see this idea of you shall not murder being expanded upon. We see in Jesus speaking to his disciples, Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22, says, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Now, this is a ramping up of expectation, right? And this is shortly after Jesus has told his disciples that unless their righteousness exceeded that of the scribes and Pharisees, they could not enter the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus begins to explain what that means. Because the scribes and Pharisees thought, well, if I hate people but I don't kill them, I'm just fine. If I don't actually go through the act of physically depriving them of life, then I haven't committed any sin and I'm okay. And I'll say most of the time where we deal with this, looking at the emotions and the premeditations and the thought processes of things, we don't tend to like going to the words of Jesus here, because they're stronger than we really like to deal with. If we look at what John says in 1 John 3:14 and 15, he says, we know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren. He who does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. And so we like this one better because, well, we can kind of fool ourselves if we're angry with someone. Well, I don't hate them. Oh, I was just angry with them, but it's okay. And here's the thing as John says, and there's other translations that read here that everyone who hates his brother has committed murder within his heart. And this isn't just a familiar brother, this is a brother of humanity, a fellow human being. If we hate someone, we have committed murder within our heart. That God counts that if we are actively hating someone, we're a murderer. And we tend to prefer this expansion of the commandment, you shall not murder, over the one that Jesus gave, because someone who murders is liable to the court. Jesus says, if you're angry with your brother, you'll be guilty before the court. Whoever says to his brother, you're good for nothing, shall be guilty before the higher court. And whoever says, you fool, would be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. That this all just builds and compounds. Now we have an interesting dichotomy here, because Paul tells us to be angry and not sin. Says that we can be angry but not sin. But Jesus, when we look at Jesus' quote here, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the courts. And there is a distinction here. There is a difference. And I believe it is when we harbor that anger. If we harbor that anger. Because if somebody does something against me, I'm going to be a little bit angry at first. And here's the reason why. And it's because anger is a secondary emotion. Psychologically speaking, anger is a secondary emotion. When someone does something to us that hurts us, it is easier for us to process that hurt as anger rather than to process the hurt itself. And so we can process through that, and it is doable without sin. And if we don't deal with it and handle the issue of why that anger has happened, it's going to sit and fester, isn't it? We all know, I mean, let's be honest. We've all had someone who did something to us that hurt us and we got angry about it, right? But how quickly did that anger go away when you reached out to mend the relationship, to offer forgiveness even if they didn't offer an apology or offer any kind of repentance? But when we forgive, the anger doesn't have any reason to stick around. The way our humanity and our psychology works, the way our brains work, is of course tainted by sin. And when that comes through, it is a reminder and an opportunity to act as God acts, not as sinful humans would act, but act as God acts. God, who is angered by sin, God, who is angered by injustice, God, who is angered by oppression, who is angered by a lack of mercy, a lack of kindness, a lack of love. God is angry and does not sin. The anger can also serve as a signal to the other person for them to see, ooh, I shouldn't have done that, or I shouldn't have said that in that way. That it's damaging to the relationship. And when we look at all the Bible has to say about murder, we see that ultimately we understand that it's a heart issue. We understand it's something that comes from within. And Jesus had said that it's not what goes into the body that defiles, but out of the reality of the heart, the mouth speaks. Out of the reality of the heart, we act. And so if we have murder in our hearts, it may just be a matter of time before we have murder on our hands. But there are those who look at this and they don't even look at what's going on underneath the surface and looking at premeditation or willful deprivation of human life, but rather they look at just the act of depriving anyone of human life for any reason, any way whatsoever. And usually those who do that will then point out, well, what about when God commits murder? And this is something that they'll like to talk about. So we're going to look at God and murder. Yeah. I am familiar with that, and the reason the translation, a lot of the other translations leave that out, is there's textual evidence that the without cause was an addition after the fact. Um, and and yeah, um, that does change. And again, with the whole thing of murder, the idea of murder is premeditation and willful. And we're going to look at some of more of these things and see what's going on here. And I'm not someone who says by any means that anger is an inherently negative emotion. Anger is not an inherently negative emotion, but it can be. The without cause means a lot, but we're going to look here and we'll see what it is that's going on here. We look at a lot of people will say, okay, well, God told the Israelites, "You shall not murder," in one breath, and then a generation later, only in as he's giving the people of Israel commands through Moses, giving them commands of what they will do as they enter Canaan, enter the promised land. He says, only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite and the Perizzite, the Hivite and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you. So, how can God say, "You shall not murder" in one breath, and then say, "Go and kill all these people"? Or how about when we look in the book of Numbers, chapter 16, and Korah rises up in rebellion. He's kind of tired of Moses and Aaron always running things and being leader, and he's like, no, no, give someone else a chance at this. We've been out in this desert for so long. Give me a shot at this. I'll get us into that promised land, no problem.